I am delighted today to have as our guest, to my mind, one of the great heroes of America today, a guy who has done probably a better job in expressing moral outrage at what has been going on in our country in recent years, and a man who has helped lead through the Moral Monday effort in North Carolina, an extraordinary biracial movement to demand justice for the people, black, white, Latino, Asian American, Native American in his own state. So it's a pleasure to welcome Reverend William Barber.
Thank you, sir.
And Reverend, thanks so much for being with us. Why don't I just start off and ask you, tell me a little bit, tell our viewers a little bit about what you're doing in North Carolina, why you're doing it, and what kind of impact you've had.
Well, thanks, Senator. And first of all, thank you for all the work you're doing and the clarity that you're bringing in this moment. I'm president of senior lecturer now, preparers of the breach. And before I worked with the Moral Monday movement in North Carolina, we decided actually 11 years ago that there needed to be a way to create fusion politics, not populism per se, but fusion, bringing together the issue of race and class and economics under a moral agenda to basically look at policy and ask three questions. Is this constitutionally consistent? Is it morally defensible? And is it economically sane? And we did that even actually when Democrats were in office. But in 2013, some people hijacked it. We don't call them Republicans, we call them extremists. They hijacked the Republican Party. And in the first 50 days, they took 180 people's unemployment. They denied 500,000 people Medicaid Spanish, 346,000 white, 30,000 veterans. They cut $1 billion from public education. They went after the LGBT community. They went after the Muslim community. And then in March, as we were remembering Selma, they began putting in place the framework for the worst voter suppression bill since Shelby. At that point, we said we had to go from not just regular meetings and lobbying, but to a moral Monday stance and be arrested even if they chose to.
And you have had, I know, just extraordinary turnouts. And what is it, a week ago you had some 80,000 people in Raleigh?
Some say upwards of 80,000. The second highest was in 2014 after we had 1,200 people that got arrested. Now watch this, 11% Republican, black and white, people from the West, on a moral agenda, saying that economics and dealing with poverty and education and health care and criminal justice reform and equal protection under the law are moral issues, whether that's constitutional morality or it's our deepest religious value. We took on the so-called religious right that we don't call religious right because we said you can't be in the public square saying the only issues are where you stand on LGBTQ issues, abortion, and prayer in the schools.
Okay. And you have managed to bring blacks and whites together in that effort. Is that right?
I like to say we have blacks, whites, Latinos, young, old. We have rural, we have urban, we have gay, we have straight, we have Muslim and Christian and Sikh and Hindus, all coming together around in the Deep South. I want to emphasize that. This is not some phenomenon outside of the South. In the South, when we criticize the governor on his issues and the legislature dropped to 19% in the polls. He never got above 43%. And this past November, not only did we win our court case against voter suppression, North Carolina was the only state that held off the coattails of Trumpism.
All right, I know you have been working really hard on what I see as one of the great crises that we face. And that is you have, as you call them, extremists who do not want to win elections by debate or by ideas. They want to make it impossible for poor people, people of color, young people, older people to vote. Tell us a little bit about your experience with voter suppression in North Carolina, how you responded.
The day after Shelby, one of our extremist legislators said, now that the headache has been removed. That was his word.
Let's be clear what he meant by that.
Yeah.
The headache meant the Voting Rights Act, the right for all people to participate in our democracy. That quote-unquote headache was removed.
And pre-clearance, which meant that before they could pass anything or remove, because the Voting Rights Act, Section 5 says you cannot retrogress. Once something is put in place, you can't take it away. After Shelby, they began to undo.
Let me interrupt you until everybody knows. Shelby was a 5-4
5-4
Supreme Court decision that gutted the 1965 Civil Rights Act.
Out of Alabama. That Sessions, by the way, supported.
Okay.
And that 5-4 decision unleashed state legislatures. It gave them the freedom to pass voter suppression laws that were not pre-cleared, which meant the Justice Department didn't look at them in advance and determine whether or not they were racist. The laws would go into effect. And so our law, Senator, was they cut early voting. They cut early voting, cut same-day registration, passed a photo ID bill that would not even accept a college ID or a federal ID as a legitimate ID.
You just told me before we were on camera that if you have a passport, United States government passport, that didn't work in North Carolina.
A state issue. You know, that's what they were trying to do, and they did. And they implemented, they did 40 changes, and we filed a suit almost within 40 minutes of them signing the bill. Took us 3 years. 3 years in the court because we didn't have the Voting Rights Act. We didn't have Section 5. We didn't have free clearance. But what that allowed, Senator, is things like this. In 2014, when one senator ran for the Senate, Tom Tillis, actually, he was the speaker that helped put this law into place. He didn't win 50% of the vote. He only won by 40,000 votes. We can track at least 75,000 that were suppressed in one study. In 2016, we had 158 less voting sites in the black community than we did in 2000.
Okay, say that again. 158 fewer voting sites in the black community.
The black and poor community. We want to get that because, see, the voter suppression hurts black people. That's the target. But it also hurts poor whites. It also hurts women. I think something in the neighborhood of 67% of women did not have the strict form of photo ID. Many whites did not use early voting. But the target is African Americans, particularly out in the South. So in Greensboro, for instance, during this election, Senator, we had 16 early voting sites in Greensboro in 2012-14. In 2016, we had one. The numbers of early voting was 66,000 votes less. Now this is after we won.
This is after you won.
Because the courts did not mandate that they had to keep the same number of sites. The courts just said that voter suppression law was a racist law. They call it intentional surgical racism, but they did not demand that they keep the same access in place.
All right. I hope everybody is hearing what the Reverend said, because it's true in North Carolina and it's true in many, many other states in this country. And what this all is about is people who don't have the guts to run in free and fair elections. The only way they think they can win is making it difficult or impossible for people who might vote against them, poor people, people of color, young people, old people, not to vote. Now imagine that in the United States of America, people jumping with joy that they can suppress the vote. How pathetic is that?
One of the federal judges asked that question. Why is it that people in North Carolina don't want people to vote? He asked it. And by the way, we won a unanimous decision. 2 white judges, 1 African American, so it's not a split decision. But because when we called them, they had emails where they actually wrote the Department of, the Board of Election or the Department of DMV, the Division of Motor Vehicles. What is the percentage of African Americans that do not have this kind of photo ID? And then that's the kind that they demanded. Or who uses the first week of early vote? We've had, they removed sites, Senator, from campuses like Appalachian State, Winston-Salem State, North Carolina Central. This was an all-out because they know that the majority of Americans in North Carolina, when they look at it from a moral perspective, do not agree with taking people's health care, taking people's public education, taking people's voting rights, attacking the LGBT community. They can't win on the issue.
And Reverend, all of this was done under the guise of voter fraud, right?
Well, they claimed voter fraud, then admitted there was no voter fraud on camera. They called it a voter integrity law, which was a voter suppression law. Because the voter fraud is a lie, voter suppression is alive and well. And we ended up, and the courts, once it got under the microscope of the courts, we won. And then when we won, we beat them in November. Now, we didn't endorse candidates, the moral movement. We endorsed issues. But in North Carolina, once we removed the voter suppression, Trump wins by 100,000 votes. But an African American wins the Supreme Court by 350,000 votes. First time we've had a progressive Supreme Court with 2 African Americans on it. We won a progressive governor, a progressive Secretary of State, a progressive AG, and a progressive auditor. And now the courts have ordered that the gerrymandering was also racist. See, that's
all right, let's talk about another issue that does not get enough discussion, not only in North Carolina, but all over this country. Now, my understanding, you correct me if I'm wrong, that in fact in congressional races in the last election, Democrats ended up getting more votes in totality than Republicans, and yet Republicans dominate in the House of Representatives. How does that happen?
Well, it happened, again, you've had the Senate and the House, in the U.S. Senate, U.S. House, has had since June 25th, 2013 to fix the Voting Rights Act. In other words, to fix Section 4, which is the formula, and then reignite Section 5. But without that, these state legislatures can pass redistricting laws that stack, pack, and bleach black voters. Now, what does that look like? It means in North Carolina that that they put 51% of all African American voters into 27 out of 120 House seats.
Wow.
49% into 19 out of 50 Senate seats. Thereby, the courts called it apartheid redistricting.
That's what the courts?
The courts call it that in the papers. They said this is apartheid redistricting. Now, the trick is they said, well, we'll give you 1 extra black Senate seat. But then they removed the ability, not for black people to elect black people,
right,
but for black and white and brown people to elect
progressives.
A coalition. That's exactly right.
Right.
So we went from a 7-6 congressional split, 7 Democrats, 6 Republicans, to 10-3. And we went from a democratically led state house to a veto-proof, extremist Republican-led House and Senate. Not because we lost, but because of cheating in gerrymandering. And of course, they ordered a new election this year.
And of course, North Carolina is not the only state.
22 states since 2010. Right after, and I believe this, is if you look at the facts, when President Obama won, what people missed, it wasn't just about President Obama that scared extremists. What scared them was he broke through the solid South and won Virginia, North Carolina, and Florida. When you break up those 13 former Confederate states, you can win 2 or 3 of them. You change the entire American electorate. So 2 years after in 2010, 22 states passed voter suppression and redistricting laws. And if you look at those 22 states, I think it represents something like 254 electoral votes, 57% of African Americans, and the majority of those states are places where the black and the brown vote have increased and allow black and white fusion to happen to elect progressives.
All right, 2 more questions. Number 1. As you know, the Republicans are anxious to repeal the Affordable Care Act. What will that mean in North Carolina if it was repealed?
It will mean something in the neighborhood of 2 million people with pre-existing conditions. Let me get real personal. My daughter was born with a brain disorder that she had treated. She's graduated from college. She's a brilliant summa cum laude, but she lives with that brain disorder. She has a pre-existing condition. There are 2 million other North Carolinians that will not have access to health care. It has meant that 500,000 people did not get Medicaid expansion. That's 346,000 white, about 130,000 African Americans, and 30,000 veterans. It means that thousands of women will no longer have access to the kind of care that they need for breast exams, cervical exams, and prenatal care. It is probably the most immoral things I've ever seen. Dr. King said of all of the great evils was the evil attack on health care. He said that one time. And Senator, what we're trying to show people is it's not a left-right debate. This is a right versus wrong. The North Carolina Constitution says in its preamble, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all persons are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the enjoyment of the fruit of their own labor. That was put in 1868 when black and white people took over the legislature.
Wow.
You see, it says in Article 11, Article 11, Section 4, beneficent provision to the poor, the unfortunate, the orphan is the first duty of a Christian and civilized state.
Wow.
When you attack voting rights and then use that power gained by that to attack and deny living wages, 79% of North Carolinians want living wages. They won't put it on the ballot. Then you attack health care and hurt millions of people. We know for every 500,000 people denied Medicaid expansion, about 2,800 people died. Died. That's what we're talking about. And we can put a face on it, a black face on it, a Republican face on it, a white face on it, and because we need to show the people. And so for me, it's personal, because when my baby came out of surgery some years ago, my prayer was to live long enough to see the system change, where if something happened to me and her mother, that she would have access to health care. And that's what happened with the affordable care. I was a universal health care person. I wanted the full, right, but at least with affordable care. And now to think, at 22 years old, 23 years old, she's now in jeopardy of going back in that category of pre-existence. It's immoral, it's ugly, it's mean-spirited, it's undemocratic, and we need to challenge it with everything we have.
Last question. I think appropriately enough, your movement is based around moral Mondays. You use the word morality a whole lot. Mm-hmm. Now, in politics, we don't hear that word morality very often, but you use it appropriately so. What does that mean exactly? What kind of, when you talk about a moral movement, what are we talking about?
A moral. But Dr. King said 50 years ago, in a speech at Riverside, in fact, I'm preaching the anniversary of that speech at Riverside this year, he said it's a time to break silence. He said America needed a moral revolution of values, and until she dealt with issues of racism, materialism, and militarism, we were in a moral deficit. For us, morality is this. In the Constitution, there's a basic framework of morality. First of all, we, not I. When candidates say I and I alone can save you, that's contrary to the moral values of our Constitution. There is an admittance that we're not a perfect nation. It says we're striving to be a more perfect. So it's a certain humility we should have. Then the establishment of justice, the providing for the common defense, promoting the general welfare. Welfare is in the Constitution. It's not an ugly word. And domestic tranquility. Those four pillars frame what we call the moral critique. So when I look at policy, does this establish justice? Not does this establish something just for them. Does this establish justice? Does this meet the common defense of all people? Does this promote the general welfare? Does this bring domestic tranquility? That's from the constitutional side. I may not be a person of faith. As a person of faith, all of the major religions, the justice, how you treat the poor, the least of these, the children, are how nations will be judged. Not just individuals, nations. I love that great Jewish text. Isaiah 6, and of course Isaiah 58 is another, but Isaiah 6 where it says, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights. When the last time you heard a politician talking about the rights of the poor of their rights, and make women and children their prey. And so that's what we mean by a moral critique. That not just, LGBT and personal morality, but public morality, public policy. We often say Dr. King didn't get killed because he loved everybody. He got killed because he dared to take policy and say, how does this reflect the love that you claim to believe in? How does this reflect justice? And we think that, and we've seen a great hunger. I've traveled to 22 states since April on what's called the Moral Revival Tour with Repairers of the Breach. I traveled with Sister Simone, Dr. James Forbes, used to be at Riverside, Tracy Blackman. Thousands of people came out, hundreds of clergy. 10,000 signed, Senator, on a letter we sent to Trump. When Kellyanne Conway said nobody had ever raised, we sent a letter certified of 10,000 clergy and religious at a higher ground moral agenda. Said, we'll meet with you, but not in the tower. Come to a house of worship.
Good
so
for
we
you.
can have a frank conversation. That hadn't happened, but there is a group of people, Senator, that are saying, just like Kennedy and Roosevelt, who from the 1912 used the word moral, and Abraham Lincoln used the word moral, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, as he was pushed by Francis Perkins, and Mansfield, and I could go on and on through others. We have to recover that language. Some issues are not left and right. It's about right and wrong.
All right. With that, let me thank you for being here today, but more importantly, for the extraordinary work you were doing. I think the work you are doing is a model for what has to happen in this country. And I thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, sir.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you for all you've done.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you all.